Welcome to our second lesson. I hope you had a great time yesterday and you had a chance to experiment with some of the concepts explained. Today we will speak about one of the most important elements in photography, the exposure triangle. We will see how we can control our camera with the precision of a medical surgeon. Let's introduce the aperture, shutter speed and ISO. First of all, let's examine them one by one. Let's talk about aperture. Yesterday, with Bob, we learned about the camera obscura. Do you remember the pinhole through which the light passes by? Now, our pinhole is the lens of the camera. The aperture in the lens is a function that controls how much open is our pinhole. Through this function, we can reduce or increase the dimension of the pinhole. As you can see on page 8 of your ebook, the result is that the more open this pinhole is, more light will enter inside the camera. The effect of this aperture are mainly two. The first is more than logical. More light is entering the camera, more the image will result bright. The second is less intuitive, and it regards the depth of field. More close is the aperture of the lens, more depth of field our camera will have. With the depth of field, I mean the subject you are photographing, the background and the foreground will result in focus or autofocus depending on the aperture. If you use an open aperture, the subject will result in focus, but the background and the foreground will be blurred. We can use this functionality at our advantage to make our subject stand out of a noisy background. In fact, this is one of the main functions professional photographers are using in a photo shoot. It is most of the time really important to focus on the subject and make the person stand out in a picture. About how this is working on the camera, the lens aperture is represented by f numbers or f-stops. The f come from the word finestra, that means window in Italian. This shows the values of the aperture. The lower the number, the more open the lens is, and the more light will allow to enter in the sensor. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it is what it is. On page 8 of your ebook, you have a great picture that sums up the effect of the aperture on light and depth of field. About this last concept, depth of field, the smaller is the number or f number, the more blurred will be the background and foreground of your picture. This function, as already said, will be particularly useful to make a subject in the picture stand out from the environment. The second function is the shutter speed. This is the easiest concept to understand. It is also called exposure time. It represents the time that your pinhole will remain open to get the light inside of the camera. The greater the time of your shutter speed, the more light reaches the sensor. This function can be used for freeze time. Think about photographing a gun bullet or a glass breaking. You can also use this function to paint with light. Think about the traffic lines painted by the car running on the highway. The shutter speed is measured with fraction of a second in your camera. You might play around this function and see the effect of increasing and decreasing this value. As shown in your ebook, you might use this also for making a flowing cascade looking like a cream, or give a motion effect to a car or anything moving towards a specific direction. The last function is the ISO. This function represents the sensibility of the sensor to the light. Usually lower is the sensibility to the light, crispier will be your image. Higher is the sensibility, more noise will have your image. This noise means that you will observe a grainy effect in your picture, which can be kind of fancy if you want to do some vintage pictures, like a black and white picture, for example. In the modern camera, this effect is reduced by the software and the technology, but is still there and sometimes can be annoying. The question to understand the utility of the ISO is asking yourself, why do I need this for? In low light situation, we might use the combination of aperture and shutter speed to have the right amount of light inside our camera. But sometimes this will not be enough. If you decrease too much the shutter speed, you will have blurred images. You cannot freeze a subject anymore, especially if you want to take a picture of your pets or your children playing. The increased amount of sensibility of your sensor will enable you to use faster shutter speed and have everything on focus. Now, put everything together, let's talk about modes. You have 4 main modes in your camera: the manual mode, the program mode, the aperture priority, and the time priority. The manual mode will enable you to have full control of your camera. With this mode, you will be able to set as you wish all 3 elements. The other 3 modes are semi-automatic modes and will help you to get quicker in action. In program mode, your camera sets the shutter speed and the aperture for you. My favorite, however, is the aperture priority mode. In this, you set your favorite aperture and the camera is setting the shutter speed for you. I use this 90% of the time. This is used mainly for portraiture, where you want to keep in control depth of field. In the time priority mode, you set the shutter speed and the camera will set the aperture for you. This, for me, is particularly useful in landscape photography, where you can also use a tripod. In all 4 modes, it is important to consider an optimal ISO that can maintain the quality of your picture. The ISO will affect the sensibility of the sensor to the light. It is important to maintain it as low as possible, but in the same time use it in a way that the shutter speed is enough to keep your subject or your picture away from blurred. Yes, you might want to do it on purpose, but usually blurred pictures don't look that nice. Here there is a trick to understand what is the best shutter speed to maintain your picture still. If you are making picture with a 50mm lens, your shutter speed shouldn't be less than 1/50 of a second. If your lens is 80mm, 1/80 of a second, and so on. This is an approximation, but will make your life much easier. Another thing to consider is the exposure of the picture. That means you don't want to have too dark or too bright pictures. In the semi-automatic modes, the perfect exposed picture is obtained finding the equilibrium between the 3 components of the exposure triangle we just saw, the so-called right exposure that would make our image nicely balanced. This value can be only evaluated with your eyes, but nowadays we are lucky and helped by technology. In fact, when we use the semi-automatic modes, aperture priority, shutter speed priority or program mode, we can set an equilibrium point to a device called exposure meter. This device, it is in the shape of a ruler and it's telling us if we are exposing or not the image based on a value. This value will be the equilibrium point of our exposure triangle. The default value of the ruler is usually 0. Not necessarily 0 is the correct value. You might have a darker image or a brighter image as a result. In this case, you can move manually the value to a brighter point or to a darker point using a function called exposure composition. If the image is exposed using the default value, the indicator will be on the center, on the 0 position. If the image is underexposed or dark, on the left side, usually represented with negative numbers. If overexposed or too bright, on the right side, usually represented with positive numbers. Bear in mind that the perfect exposure is measurable with your eyes or with a special device called light meter. The exposure meter helps you only to balance the 3 elements of the exposure triangle, and we shouldn't rely only on that. Today you have the ability to check the image directly on the camera. You can always underexpose or overexpose an image consciously, depending on the situation you want to represent. Using the manual mode, you don't need to set an equilibrium point. You will set your aperture, your shutter speed and your ISO. but the ruler will tell you if you are above or under the default value that is 0. This can be helpful in certain situations, but start the good habit to double check the results before going ahead in your photoshooting session. And now it is time of practice. There are different models of camera. You can easily find all the functions that I point out looking into internet or in the user guide of your camera. And now I have a surprise for you. You can send your question or your comment to me in the Facebook group I created for you, and you will find it in the page. This will improve my awareness to get better in my explanation and will clarify your doubts on what explained. In the coming weeks, I will also offer some free Q&A sessions. Stay tuned and see you tomorrow with our next lesson. This is Fabio Calvelli at Stand by Pix, and thank you.